Hello, I'm Ray and welcome to another episode on Ray Report. Just a quick one.
IMF, World Bank, all other institutions, they make African countries jump through hoops. Loans will never be able to pay. The US, when they borrow money, they're getting it in 1.5, 1.9 interest rate. Africans, when they get the same amount of money, they're paying 9, 10%. The people who don't need a break, they get a break. The ones who need a break, they don't get a break. The sheer survival of the World Bank, IMF, is based on the fact that African countries and many other developing countries do not succeed. Their success is based on our failure.
Recent happenings in Africa made me to revisit an interview that was conducted some 9 months ago by Wedemaya together with the former AU ambassador to the United States, Dr. Arikana Chimobori. Now you ask yourself if Africa really gained independence from its colonial masters. This very interview and revelations that was made by the former AU ambassador will make you cry or get worried as an African. So I'm breaking this very interview down.
Today, France is taking out of Africa, Francophone Africa, over $500 billion. Over $500 billion. We, the Africans, the poor countries, we're giving France over $500 billion a year in, year out. And no one is talking about it.
Wow, that is an interesting revelation there. Over $500 billion that is being taken from Africa to Europe. And yet Africa is considered as the poorest country. I mean, how possible is that? This is just one aspect of the interview. Let me just give you more of exactly what transpired between Wedemaya and Dr. Arikana. Sadly, Dr. Arikana lost her job just because she was telling the truth about Africa.
The first speech that terminated your contract as the AU ambassador to America.
No, actually the termination came like 6 months later. I had been expecting it, and I was aware of some phone call that had been made. And so I was just waiting for that phone call to say, okay, your days are numbered. You're out of here. But it took them 6 months to do that.
But you're speaking for your people.
I was only speaking the truth. That's why my conscience was very clear, and I will continue to speak the truth.
It's just that our people don't like the truth, I guess.
I think our people want the truth. It's the powers that be that don't like the truth. Our people are waking up.
What are the powers that you're talking about?
On the problem of the continent of Africa, what exactly is the problem of Africa and its people? And this was how Dr. Arikana responded to Wedemaya.
You've always been talking about the problem of the continent, but I'm here today. I really want to ask you, now you're living in Zimbabwe.
Right.
What is the problem of Africa?
Oh, sir, that is the deep question. Deep as it is, it's also a very simple one at the same time. I like to take it back to when we were getting our independence. I think the issue of Africa really goes allow me to classify the issues, the reasons why this tree of life that is Africa is ailing. And I'm going to divide the issues between the two. Problems that are causing this tree to ail, but problems above the root, above the ground. And issues that are making this tree ail that are below the ground, issues of the root. Quite often, we are focusing on the issues above the root, issues above the ground. Issues like the leaves and the flowers and the fruits and the branches that are falling off one season after another. Those issues like leadership, issues like corruption, issues like poor access to healthcare, poor education, poor infrastructure. Those are all issues above the ground. They come and they go. We change leaders every day in Africa. But tell me one African country that changed a leader and things changed. We might see some improvement, but fundamentally.
Though Africa is considered as one of the poorest countries with its people, which is the negative narrative that is being portrayed in the Western countries. You know what? The saddest of all is that countries that are being colonized by France are even worse off. Listen to Dr. Arikana making some interesting revelations about countries that were colonized by France.
Former French colonies are even in a worse shape, in the sense that the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization, which I spoke on, it continues to make the African countries, those 14 African countries, deposit their bank reserves with France to this day. The only difference is it started at 85%, and now it's down to about 55, 65. But they're still depositing their bank reserves. And if they wish to borrow some of that money, they've been depositing for years, they have to put in an application as a loan. And they can only access 20% of what they deposited the previous year as a loan at commercial interest rates. I want to underscore that. They can only borrow their own money upon approval of an application after submitting their country financials. If approved, they can only access 20% of the previous year's deposit as a loan at commercial interest rates.
That is our reality. It gets better. They were also told that if you need any military equipment, you can only purchase it from France. Your military can only be trained by France. That France will have military presence in your own country and can invade you without notice should they feel French interests are being violated. Language of instruction shall be French. All your minerals discovered, yet to be discovered, France has the first right of refusal. All the contracts, big contracts, private and public, French companies have the first right of refusal. Now, my brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, if you were to go home and run for president, and your first day in office, your chief of staff comes to you and says, oh, by the way, Mr. President, Madam President, before you start, I must read you the do's and don'ts as stipulated by the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. And your chief of staff reads this to you. What power do you have?
Can African countries have the right to print their own currencies? Is that even possible?
Forget printing money. When you have to borrow your own money, how much power do you have?
Because printing money, you also have to pay for printing your own money for you.
They are printing their money for them. All the money is printed in France. It gets worse. So you give up your financial control, your military equipment, training has to be done in France. Your natural resources, discovered, yet to be discovered. French companies have first right of refusal. So you've given up your natural resources, you've given up your military control, you've given up your financial control, and you still call that person a leader. What are they leading? You have stripped them of anything that they can do to be a true leader. That's why I say it's a fake independence.
until we as a people, as Africans, understand the root causes of why Africa is where it is today.
African leaders know this problem.
Oh yes, they do. But like I said, they're fighting with their hands tied. And because they're fighting as small little countries, and this is where we're being defeated as well.
Then they followed it with colonization, a systematic way of saying now that we have made the African believe that everything African was bad and everything European was better. Let's take it to the next level. So it is that they met in Berlin and decided to chop up our country, our continent rather. So it is they met in Berlin, Germany, at the invitation of the then Chancellor of Germany, Bismarck, specifically to come up with a strategy that once again would see to it that Africa and her children are forever defeated and dominated. They spent 4 months, 4 cold months in Berlin, Germany, from November of 1884 to February of 1885. And by the time they were done, our Africa had been chopped up into the tiny little countries that we see today. Countries that were intentionally divided in such a way that individually they will never survive. That individually they are easy to exploit. The whole purpose was to see to it that they can continue to exploit the rich natural resources that we were endowed with in our beloved continent.
How do you think Togo is going to push back against China? How is Togo going to push back against European nations? Are you with me? That is the biggest problem.
So which means that we need to unite as
no question about it. That's what Kwame Nkrumah was talking about. That's what the Casablanca Group was all about. We cannot survive without unity. End of story. So really, of the pillars of development, of the pillars of Africa's development and Africa's unity, which you talk about, we need our own financial system, our own single currency, central bank, monetary fund, stock exchange. African, we need our own military. We need our own, now we managed with trade. That's the only one we've managed to really begin to show and have a semblance of some unity through the AFCFTA.
I think it's just a building.
It's a building, and its implementation is going to be a challenge. Even now, as we speak, you had problems coming here. You say, why should you have problems traveling throughout Africa? If we now have the free trade area, why are we now not just traveling freely? That free movement of people, it's spoken about, but it needs to be actualized. Why do Africans still need visas to travel in Africa?
For me, I just want to say this. I don't know if you will agree with me. I think the Pan-African spirit that was used to establish the African Union is dead. Do you agree with me?
Long gone. We often say if the Casablanca Group had won in 1963, Africa would be in a different place.
There were just seven people.
There were only 7, yeah. That's why they lost. So the Monrovia Group, they were the majority. They said, oh, let's go slow on this Pan-African thing, on this African unity. Let's go slow. And then after we started going slow, we've been going slow ever since. If we were to go back to the ideals of the Casablanca Group, Africa would have been in a very, very much better place by now.
When you hear the name Africa, what comes into your mind?
Poverty. Disease. I mean, I know better, but I know that's what people think.
I mean, what comes into your mind?
No, in my mind, yep, I see an amazing continent, the richest continent on earth, a continent full of vibrant young minds, a continent that if only we could unite, we can rule the world. That's the Africa I see. But I know the Africa that people out there see. And
what is the Africa that they see?
The Africa out there, it's a diseased and dying continent, at war, constantly at war with itself, hunger and starvation and disease, which is far from the truth. Which is far from the truth. Look at Zimbabwe.
It's listed as one of the top 10 worst places to live, top 10 worst places to invest. And yet, the truth is the exact opposite.
Another aspect of the interview that interests me most was the conversation around borderless Africa. Traveling within the sub-region has become a major concern for many Africans, moving from one country to another within the same sub-region. And the conversation with Dr. Arikana centered on the very issues that most Africans are calling for, which is the borderless Africa.
What do you think a borderless Africa would do to Africans?
Oh my God, Africa will take off like wildfire. Just the free movement of people. The Cape to Cairo highway, to think that a woman can get up in the morning with her produce, and by mid-morning she's in Kinshasa, and by the following day she's in Cairo, and then she can take an overnight bullet train back to Cape Town. That's the Africa I'm talking about. You talk about commerce. You know, this continent is quite an amazing continent. You'd think that it's Africa and we are similar. No, there are products in Zimbabwe that people in Zambia want. There are products in Zimbabwe or Southern Africa that people in West Africa want. You know, it's amazing how intra-Africa trade alone, we don't need outsiders. Intra-Africa trade alone could change Africa overnight.
Now, this aspect of the interview even shocked me the most. She said African leaders or presidents of the various countries within Africa do not need money from their colonial masters, if only the resources are being utilized to the benefits of the people. Take a listen to what exactly she said.
Country is spending a third to 40%, some up to 60% of their GDP on loan repayment. That alone, son, it's like saying, you take 60% of my lunch, and then you wonder why I can't gain weight. I need my entire lunch every day. But if you're going to be taking 60% of my lunch, then you don't even want to talk about my 60% that you have taken. You only want to talk what I can or cannot do with the remaining 30 or 40%. That's what's happening to Africa. When you look at countries that have to pay such huge amounts of loans, given high interest rates that are not justified, a lot of the African countries, many have never defaulted on their loan repayment to all these institutions, and yet the rating agencies, they rate them very poorly, so they get, in order to justify giving them high interest rates. You know, countries like Greece that completely collapsed, they get better interest rates than a lot of African countries that have never been in that situation. The international finance system must be analyzed, and we're asking those involved to give Africans a break, and that we must treat Africa fairly. We must demand that.
One thing many people talk about is how Africans don't believe in themselves. And this is an agenda or a strategy which has been programmed by our colonial masters to see Africans as people who do not believe in themselves, who cannot even do something for themselves. Wodemaya asked this very question in the interview with Dr. Arikana, and let's take a listen to what exactly she said.
You know, like, we don't believe in ourselves that we can do so many things.
That's right.
So I don't know if you've heard
emphasize on black. Oh, we black people. Oh, we black people. What about we Africans? The mothers and fathers of humanity, the origin of civilization, the ones who taught the world what it means to be human. That's we, the Africans. Why can't we emphasize on that? We don't, because we're programmed to just demoralize ourselves. We are on a path of self-destruction. How do we get you young people to wake up? Because we're in a trance. A trance of sheer stupidity. Some of the things that we do as Africans, as people of color, things that we could do to help ourselves, we do not do. We're in a trance. We've been put to sleep. What is it going to take for us to realize that we are asleep and we need to wake up?
self-hate in Africa.
Oh, it's big. Subliminal messaging. That's where we began, the self-hate, the mistrust of each other, the lack of appreciation, an idea that is coming from your brother, an idea that is coming from your sister, because we are taught to dislike anything to do with us. And that is the biggest enemy right now. A colonized African mind is the worst thing Africa can have.
I mean, if you have a message to Africans in terms of self-hate, what would that message be?
I would say, wake up, Africans. Understand yourself. Understand you're a victim of white supremacy. That you are the origin of humanity, and without you, the rest of the world wouldn't be.
Without Africa?
Without Africa.
The world cannot function.
Absolutely. The world needs Africa. Africa does not need the world. And that's a fact, and they know it. There is nothing that we need that we cannot find in Africa. Fact. Are you happy with the world the way it is today? Are you happy living this world the way it is for your children, grandchildren, and generations to come? I hope. The answer is no. 20 years from now, your children and grandchildren are going to ask you, grandfather, grandmother, there were issues with our beloved continent, Africa. There were problems with the race, our race, as black people. What did you do, grandmother? What did you do, grandpa? For you to be able to answer that question, that journey begins now. My hope is 20 years from now, you can say, granddaughter, grandson, sit down. These were the issues in our beloved Africa. These were the issues with black people. Together with my brothers and sisters, we came together. We pulled our financial resources together. And this is what we did. While the mission is not yet accomplished, this is where we left off. And this is where you, together with your brothers and sisters, need to come together and pick up where we left off.
Thank you so much for the interesting insights that you've just shared to the rest of the world. Hats off to you. Dr. Arikana just earned my respects. These are the kind of people we need in Africa. They are championing the African unity and the African agenda. We need to pray for people like this to take up positions in Africa. With a population of over 1.2 billion people in Africa, I believe that if African leaders are utilizing or should utilize the resources wisely, we don't need the West to survive. As Dr. Arikana indicated in the interview, the West and France need Africa. Africa doesn't need the West to survive. And if all this can be done and the people of Africa can move from the liberation, I believe Africa will be the continent that everyone will be eyeing. What do you make of these revelations that Dr. Arikana said? And guess what? Dr. Arikana is from Zimbabwe.